a quick reminder about the Prop 1 fight and the ballot initiative that we had at the end of last year. We did a couple of programs trying to just, dispel some of the myths that were going on specifically with Prop 1. But that led a lot of people to start questioning this whole ballot initiative process anyway, which is again, the whole Medicaid expansion came about because of a ballot initiative, and we'll get into more of that later. But one of the people at the tip of the spear on that fight against Prop 1 was Michael Angiletta, and he joins me now. He is with Secure Idaho. Welcome to the program, Michael. Can you give us a little bit of just a little bit of a taste of what you guys were able to help do during the Prop 1 fight, and then we'll get into where you guys are headed next here.
You bet. Thanks for having me. And it's exciting to see you on the other side of that election. And I'll confess, leading up to that election, I thought it was going to be a real nail biter. I thought we would barely win. And I was incredibly gratified to see we got more votes than Donald Trump got in Idaho. So somebody was doing their job right. And I think it really can be, I think a lot of folks can account for that success, and primarily the grassroots that we worked with was a big part of it. Real quick, anecdotally, we did a poll 30 days out from that election, and it wasn't looking good. I'd say about over a third of Idahoans were undecided, and otherwise it was even Steven. And all of the money for Prop 1 was coming in, about $5 million worth. Everybody was getting 1, 2, 3 pieces of mail in their mailbox, and we had nothing. We ended up, I think, combined, our coalition spent about $500,000 compared to their $5 million. So we concentrated that money in the last 30 days, but it really wasn't the money that told the tale. It was the grassroots organizing that told the tale. So from our perspective, it was important just to get the word out in terms of education and awareness. What the heck is this ranked choice voting thing? Nobody asked for it. So where's it coming from? And why would anybody want to mess with this simple high trust system? And by having that very simple truth on our side, that it's a very complex scheme that erodes transparency and trust in what otherwise is a very high trust institution in Idaho, that truth allowed us to amplify our message as opposed to the $5 million that they needed to propagandize folks into thinking, wow, this is somehow a really good thing. So we did education to answer your question. We created a speaker network. We did lots of educational talking point papers and speaker decks for folks, getting them trained up on the issues related to the technicalities of what does this actually mean, jungle primaries and ranked choice voting, and how could that damage the trust? And then we did the grassroots organizing across a lot of groups that otherwise don't always easily work well together. But we could all agree that Proposition 1 was a danger to Idaho and its future. And so we synchronized efforts, we synchronized strategy, we synchronized messaging while still keeping it disaggregated. Think of the brush fires.
No, I mean, you're so right. So many people came together, and I think one of the unifying factors of the reason why so many people were able to come together is because we were all speaking the truth about this thing. And so when there is an objective truth out there, which actually exists, people, you can unite on that front as easily as it seemingly did in hindsight, but it wasn't so easy during the fight, though. So yes, well, very good. Congratulations on all that you did, and now moving forward with this whole ballot initiative process, we know that this is how Idaho got a Medicaid expansion, which has blown up the budget incredibly, just out of the water. And we're going to talk more about that later in the program. But we also know that coming down the pike that there's probably something to deal with bringing back abortion through ballot initiative, maybe legalizing marijuana through ballot initiative. And so all of these things seemingly are big ideas that come outside of Idaho. They're not necessarily a vast majority of people going for these things. And so I know you did a survey, you did a study, and you're looking into what can we do to either modify, change, get rid of. I mean, walk us down here and we have your survey here, but walk us through what it is you guys are focused on now and what kind of results we can look at here.
Yeah, and I'm excited to get in the findings. We did do a statewide poll of likely voters, and we'll spend some time going into those very interesting and revealing findings, which I think can inspire our legislators to make really meaningful reform. I think it's important to set the table, though, and say, well, why are we all so concerned about ballot initiatives? And you certainly alluded to it, right? We see more ideas coming from out of state that the general populace of Idaho, they're not asking for. For instance, they didn't beg for ranked choice voting. Nobody was saying, please, we need ranked choice voting to help Idaho. No, that was an idea from ivory towers and distant lands. And that's not just academic ideas, it's moral ideas that aren't necessarily congruent with what Idaho wants, right? And then they bring the money in to support those ideas. And hence we have the ballot initiative. And hence we're always on our heels defending ourselves and our values. And I'll draw our attention to two things that will lead us up to this ballot survey. The first is, and this is kind of interesting, I wanted to understand, well, where did the ballot initiative come from? What was its inception? What was its conception? Why did somebody want to create a ballot initiative in the first place? And it goes back to a guy named William Marin in Oregon in 1902. And the reason why, he was a progressive, and at the time, progressives were the populist. He was a populist. And he wanted to basically allow the Oregon voters to have an authentic voice without being corrupted by out-of-state moneyed interests from distant lands. So at the time, the legislature was very corrupted by railroad companies whose headquarters were out of state, who wanted to shape legislation and policy that was contradictory to the will of the people. So the entire inception of ballot initiatives was to get rid of those corrupting influences of moneyed interests out of state. That's ironic, right? Because if we fast forward now 100 years later, we see that that very tool that was used to usurp the corruption of out-of-state moneyed interests has now been co-opted by those out-of-state moneyed interests. So keep that in mind, especially when we go through the statewide survey findings. You are going to see the spirit of William Marin now embodied by our Idaho voters. They are speaking the same concerns that were said 120 years ago. I'll bring us back to one last piece of context leading up to the survey, and that's our Prop 1 experience. And not so much the technicalities of Prop 1, but the structure and process of ballot initiatives themselves. And there were four big contentious issues. It doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right, if you're progressive or conservative. We can all agree that the representation and alleged misrepresentation of getting people to sign the petition was a contentious issue, right? There were a lot of folks that said, hey, I was told one thing and it turns out I signed something else. Contentious issue. The second one was ballot titles. Right. So our AG went to battle in the courts. He won one, lost a couple. It was related to calling it open primaries or blanket primaries, or can you call it a system, and so on and so forth. So there were actual court battles about that. And then another contentious issue was related to obviously the out-of-state funding. That goes without saying, right? We had a fiscal impact statement, first of all, that said it would cost a few $100,000 from the proponents. Department of Financial Management had 20 days, which isn't nearly enough time to look at it. They came up with like 1.2 million. And then our secretary said, hold on, wait a minute. I've done more due diligence. It's going to cost $40 million. So that's a big difference, right? 300,000, 40 million.
Yeah.
That's not conducive to good governance when we don't have any idea how much something like that's going to cost. So those are contentious issues. We all can agree on whether or not we're conservative or progressive. So most Idahoans agree we need to do something about it. We need to reform the ballot initiative process. And that led us to the survey to ask Idahoans, what are their concerns? What do they feel is broken in the ballot initiative process? And what reforms would they like to see? And that takes us to our statewide survey.
Okay, great. So now, so can I ask before we jump into it, how many people did you survey, and what is their status? I mean, were these just anybody, or did you focus on voters? Like what's the demographics?
Great question. And some of the viewers might be aware BSU recently came up with their 10th annual public policy survey. And it's always interesting. However, it's important to draw a distinction with methodology. So they asked 1,000 Idaho, not even voters, people that live in Idaho that are 18 or over, what their opinions were. The challenge with that, of course, is, well, they're not even necessarily voters, let alone likely voters, and they might not even legally reside in Idaho. They just happen to be living there at the time. So take that for what it's worth. For our survey, to answer your question, we're targeting a margin of error of 5%. So that got us to a population of about 400 likely voters that we surveyed. And that was the definition. You're a likely voter who's a legal resident of Idaho, full stop. And then we made sure to sample all of the different regions to have an accurate representation of the demographics. And that's the other key. You'll notice BSU, the balance geared towards and biased a little bit towards more education than the likely voter in Idaho, and a little bit more liberal than the average likely voter in Idaho. So we corrected for that when we undertook this survey, which meant it took a lot longer, by the way.
Okay. Yeah, of course. Okay. So then let's get into some of these questions here. And we got the whole deck. We won't have time to go through the entire thing, but which questions should we focus on here? We'll do one or two, and then we'll do a break and then come back, but go right ahead.
Yeah. And we can skip some of the less interesting ones. Obviously this one's interesting. We started the poll with asking a very broad question. Are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the ballot initiative process? And I think the signal's pretty clear here. 58% of the respondents said they're generally satisfied with the initiative process. Now, for somebody like me who's extremely dissatisfied with the process, I was a little surprised and disappointed in the result, but it is what it is.
Yep.
What you'll find as we go through the poll, though, as we start talking about specific concerns, that satisfaction changes dramatically. Okay, so we'll skip this one. Not very interesting. Let's go this one. So in the BSU survey, there was a question about out-of-state money and donor reporting. It clocked in at 75%. In here, we asked our respondents, are you concerned with out-of-state funding of ballot initiatives? 74%. And over 50% are very concerned. This is a ridiculously strong signal. And I'll just share one anecdote about this. When we go back at Prop 1, when I was giving some town hall and informational talks about Prop 1, I had a guy from Bonner County. I guess you'd call him a crunchy conservative, looked like a hippie, but super conservative, Christian homesteader. And he got up and asked the question, how does it make sense that out-of-state millionaires and billionaires can fund a proposed change to Idaho state law that they won't even be subject to? Help me make sense of that. And sure, we could talk about Citizens United and constitutional issues, but there was a moral and ethical and, quite frankly, horse sense truth to his question. And we're going to see this theme continue to reemerge as we go through the poll. Okay, so keep this one in mind. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into that in a moment, so we can keep going.
Great.
So the next one is just a broad question. Number of signatures required to place initiatives on the ballot. Now you'll notice we say too few or too many. So about half of the respondents said they had some concern. We don't know yet if it was they want more signatures or less signatures. As we go forward in the survey, we're going to find out and dig deeper into that. And the same went for geographic distribution. Both of those questions are related to what kind of mandate and representation should be the minimum threshold before an initiative qualifies for the ballot. And there's
most people, Michael, do most people even know how many signatures or what the demographics are? I would imagine most people don't actually know those hard numbers or what it takes to get something on the ballot, right?
No, they don't. Right. And
okay.
Right. And we'll talk about that as we go into some of the specific reforms, what the current thresholds are and why that's a problem and why certain legislators are working to reform that and change that. Okay.
Great.
Let's keep going. Related to money, dollars and cents. You remember we talked about what was that cost of that Prop 1 thing anyways? Well, you can see that the majority of our respondents had a concern about the accuracy of the fiscal impact statement. And they're going to come in pretty strong on at least one proposed reform and how we might address that. So that's our first little teaser there. But again, the money thing, how much is this ballot initiative going to cost? Why is all this money coming from out of state? This theme continues to reemerge. Okay,
right,
let's keep going.
Well,
okay,
this is something like, even if I didn't know how many signatures, I would say it should be collected evenly throughout the districts. Is that not the case now, or go ahead?
That's right. And that's what you're going to see. So if you look at this one, this asks about, again, these are signatures to qualify an initiative for the ballot. And we asked the question two ways of the respondents. What do you think about at least having a requirement to have evenly distributed signature gathering across both congressional districts? And go to the next one, and then we'll talk about why we're asking this question. We asked the same question now about legislative districts. And in both cases, it's about 55%, although the strongly support an even number, a minimum number of signatures to be gathered in all LDs is slightly higher. And the spirit of this concern, and the reason why you're seeing support here, is there's a concern that proponents of a particular initiative, an initiative that expresses and represents ideas that doesn't necessarily represent the average Idahoan, they're able to get enough signatures because they only go to a few select districts and regions that are generally urban centric and more liberal oriented. And that's enough for them, representing still relatively narrow interests, to get the initiative on the ballot. And so what you see here is people say, hey, wait a minute, what about the rural conservative districts? Don't we get a say in whether or not there's a mandate here? And so the spirit of broadening the representation and the mandate before a bad idea gets to the initiative is something our respondents want.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. All right. Well, let's take a short break. Let everybody kind of digest what they just saw, and we'll jump into the back half of this and hopefully give people a way to help figure out how to help you guys in what to expect. So we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.